Hello and welcome to another episode of Unfollowing Mum. Or maybe this is your first episode. If it is, I'm just going to throw it out there. Go back. Don't start here. Go on back and listen to the previous episodes, because today I want to talk about something a little bit more specific. Something that I think some of you might relate to. Some of you might be like, no, that's not my experience at all. But I honestly think the majority of you, if you sit with it, will relate to it in some way, shape or form. And it's a little bit complicated to explain what I'm thinking of, how I'm feeling. And I think that brushes up against that sensitivity of always being called ungrateful, selfish, spoiled, all of those wonderful terms that so many of us experienced at the hands of our parents. And we don't want to sound ungrateful. But what I wanted to talk to you, or dramatic is another one that comes up big time here for me, that really makes me think, oh, yeah, is this just me being dramatic? And I don't think for a second that it is. But you know, part of what happens when you have toxic parents who essentially condition you all your life to consider yourself dramatic, to consider yourself a drama queen or ungrateful or selfish or spoiled, and you have to fight against those narratives that you've been taught, and you have to reparent yourself and your inner child and your inner teen to go, hey, we are none of those things. It's really difficult to let go of it. But anyway, what I wanted to talk about today, you know how you might be in a relationship or you might have a friendship. I would say this is certainly more prevalent in relationships where you have no contact with your parents, or you have a very, very difficult relationship with your parent, and then your partner has his parents or her parents who are very involved and who are brilliant, who you get on with great, who you're really appreciative for, and yet, and this is not a but, because it is an and yet, when things happen where, and this is so normal by the way, within every family relationship, within every relationship full stop, people brush up against our boundaries, and that's so normal. But when you have a parent of your partner brushing up against your family boundaries, in my experience, there is this almost kind of hypersensitivity to it. Almost a resentment, I would say, of, okay, well, your parents have done this, but if my parent did that, then there would be all hell let loose. If my parent did that. And the logical part of your brain is going, well, yeah, because your parent's a giant douche canoe. Your parent does this with intent. Your parent has no respect for your boundaries whatsoever. Your parent is the type of parent who sees your boundary and deliberately crosses it just to see if they can get a rise out of you. So, of course, the reaction's going to be different if your parent did this, because the intent is different, because the past experiences are different. And yet, there's that big kind of and yet there that sits for me saying, well, hang on a minute, if my parent overstepped our family boundary, there would be so much drama. But for your parent, it's just like, oh, we'll have a gentle conversation about it. And I think it's because we can have that gentle conversation. So, for example, if my partner's parents overstep a boundary, I know that I can go to them and say, hey, we don't do that in our house. Or take, for example, when the kids were young, they used to buy toy guns. And myself and my partner didn't like toy guns. And obviously this is like a really small, tiny thing that was a bit of a niggle. There have been much bigger things that have really bothered us in the past that we've always felt able to go and speak to his parents about. And yeah, it's awkward. Yeah, it's really uncomfortable. Nobody likes going up to a family member and saying, hey, you've done this, and this has really bothered me because it crosses my boundaries. Please don't do it again. It feels uncomfortable. It's always going to be uncomfortable in certain relationships. But take this toy gun one, for example. His parents bought them toy guns. And we'd said, we don't like toy guns. We don't let them have them at home. I don't mind if they're like the massive Nerf ones that are bright yellow, but the ones that, you know, kind of look like guns, don't buy them for the kids, please. And on this particular occasion, they'd gone to a fun fair. The kids had won toys. And what did they pick? Naturally, my eldest was like, I'm picking the gun. Because of course he did. Of course he did. So that's what he decided to do. They didn't stop him. They said it was fine. And they'd said, you know what, don't worry about it. We will keep that at our house because we know mum and dad don't like it. Now, to me, that felt very much like okay, that's overstepping. It might have been done with kind intent, but it's overstepping, because to me, that was very much we'll keep this here. And they don't have to know about it, even though they've asked us not to let you have these things. We could have encouraged them to pick anything else or flat out told them no. But at the time, they didn't. And in this instance, I remember having a conversation with my partner and being like, look, you are really quite blasé about this. I am not that riled up, but I'm getting more riled up now, because if my mum did that, and he's like, yeah, but your mum would deliberately encourage them to get the guns, teach them to lie to us about it, teach them to do this, and then tell them that we were horrible and awful. Your mum would make such a big drama out of this really simple situation. They're worlds apart. And of course he's right. But I think because it feels so weird when you can see that normal conversation. And the conversation that happened was, hey, we know he picked this up. We did ask that he doesn't have these again. We would appreciate it if you didn't tell him that he can have this at your house, and we just won't say anything. It's not a big deal, because to us it is a big deal. And you might be listening to this thinking, oh my goodness, over toy guns. I'm using this as an example. There have been other things, as I say, and there always is going to be in families, because that is families. Everybody has different boundaries, different ideas of how things should be done. But invariably, if we go to my partner's parents and say, I don't like this oversteps our boundary, this is not how things are done in our family, they are respectful of that. And if they overstep a boundary, they are really upset that they've overstepped it. Or my mother-in-law really wants to make sure that that doesn't happen again, really wants to be respectful, will always encourage the kids, what mum and dad says goes. And obviously in her house, it's different. It's like, look, when they're with you, this might happen, but we don't teach them to lie. We don't teach them to do this. We don't teach them to do that. We set those boundaries, as all parents do. And another thing that I have noticed is that, yes, there's always that uncomfortable feeling around setting boundaries. It's never nice when someone crosses your boundary. And even if you feel safe to say, hey, I didn't like that, or hey, that isn't how we would do things, there's still a little bit of uncomfortability about calling someone out and saying that's not going to fly around me. And it can feel really awkward, but when you have been raised believing that boundaries should be non-existent in a loving family, that it's not loving or kind or good to set boundaries, that it's unhealthy to set boundaries, and you've essentially been taught by your parents, certainly my experience with my mum was very much that if I had any kind of boundary with her, then I was being cruel, I was being selfish, I was being spoiled, I was hurting her, how dare I? She would want to talk to me about what sex life, she would want to talk to me about relationships, she would want to be involved in my relationship while saying I'm not involved in this, but making sure she overheard arguments, always took sides, always got herself involved in some way, told all her friends about it, all these kind of things. Wanted to be involved in the parenting. If I said, hey, I remember one occasion she'd come up to my son and my husband was holding him, and he was only a few months old, and maybe he was a little bit older, so he would have been nearer one because he was quite a big boy, and we were laughing and giggling, and he was giggling, and she'd gone in with her face and licked his cheek and his neck, and it was meant to be, in her mind, she said, tickling. Now looking at that through the lens of knowing what I experienced as a child and so much covert sexual abuse in the way she behaved, I feel extremely uncomfortable around it. My husband picked it up immediately. He was like, no, absolutely not. And he looked at me and said, I don't like that. Make sure she does not do that again. And that I'm not having that. I didn't like it. And I was like, what? That was a bit of an overreaction, isn't it? At the time, she was only playing. But actually, it made him so uncomfortable that it was one of the few times that he fully stepped in and was like, no way. And I had a chat with her and said to her, Mum, we don't like it when you do that with Ruben. Can you not? Because it was just a bit grotty, like you're licking his neck and things. I know you didn't mean anything by it, but we'd prefer it if you did not lick the child. And she was livid. She was absolutely furious. You've made me feel so disgusting. You've made me feel so ashamed, like I'm some kind of paedophile or doing something wrong. Like, mate, you said it. Like, you are doing something wrong. It's weird. We've asked you not to do it. Other people might think, well, that just sounds funny. Like, we blow raspberries on it. This wasn't blowing raspberries. This was like licking on his neck. It was weird. And it was uncomfortable looking back on it. But whether it was done because it was weird or whether it was done purely through play, we as the parents had said, hey, we're not keen on that. And rather than just go, oh no, I really didn't mean it anyway, and I say, no, we know you didn't, we're not having a go, we're just saying, can you not do that in future? And it'd be maybe a little bit awkward. It was a big explosive thing. I don't think she spoke to me for a few days because I'd made her feel like she was dirty or wrong, when actually it was her action that had made her uncomfortable. And what had upset her was that her daughter had tried to set a boundary. So when you have those kind of explosive things over setting boundaries, even those tiny little ones there, you are absolutely going to feel uncomfortable, you're going to feel awkward and really resistant to setting boundaries in the beginning. I think I've got quite good now at setting boundaries, and I will say if I do not like something, I will quite often look to Adam and be like, I expect you to say that to your parent because I think that comes better coming from you. And I guess in a way there's a part of me that's like, you know full well, Harriet, that's your avoidance of setting boundaries, because I can be terrible at setting them in other areas of my life. I'm not very good at setting them with my partner. I can slip into fawn response quite quickly. I've got much better, and it is like flexing a muscle. I know I say this all the time, but it absolutely is like flexing a muscle. But there is something to me about you having to step forward in your relationship with your parent and set those boundaries and not relying on it being your spouse. And it's something that we can do together. But the reaction is so different. And that in itself feels quite uncomfortable to me, I think, because I'm expecting there to be some kind of big dramatic problem. I remember our middle child was really anxious about going away for a few days, and he'd not been particularly well. He was so anxious about going away. My in-laws had booked this lovely weekend for him. They'd geared it all towards him. They'd got loads of surprises for him. And he was so anxious he made himself ill. And he gets really bad travel anxiety when it comes to the train or the planes anyway. And he just didn't feel like he could do it. So my husband said, right, off he goes to bed. I will tell my mum she can't take him. It's as simple as that. We will reimburse them if that's what they want. And they absolutely didn't. It didn't even enter their minds to suggest it. But they were initially very disappointed. Oh no, come on, let me go and have a chat with him. And he just said, no, he's asleep. He's not coming. It's not right for him. He's absolutely mortified at the idea of going away. And it's not because it's about you, it's because of his travel anxiety. And there was a real disappointment, but there was complete understanding that that was what was right for the kids and that we had to put our kids first. And I think a part of me really wanted to cry, just watching her be so obviously disappointed and feeling really guilty that we'd disappointed her and feeling really upset that he was going to miss out on something that he would have absolutely loved. But also just that understanding that I know I would never get if the roles were my mum in that seat. It would be lots of guilting, lots of shame, lots of you've done this, you've done that. In fact, I remember as a child being made to go away with my aunt and uncle, and I'd asked to go, and I was super excited. And then when I got there, I had big anxiety, like crazy anxiety, being separated from my mum because we were so enmeshed. And I remember saying, I don't think I can go on the next part of this holiday. I'd been staying at the house for a few days. I've got vague memories of this. And it was my older cousin had introduced me to Friends. Never watched Friends. I think I watched 2 or 3 minutes of it and was like, I don't think it's for me. And she was really nasty to me. She was like, it's the coolest thing in the world. She was a teenager. And I was little. I was scared. I didn't want to stay. And my mum very much did feed into that and come and pick me up eventually. But the reaction from the extended family, I remember everybody sitting in a room And there must have been loads of them, all the kids, adults I didn't know, and my aunt and uncle that were like, come on, Harriet, I think you need to go. And the pressure of that was horrific, absolutely horrific. And then teenagers, no, she needs to get a grip. It was awful. It was a horrible experience. And to be fair to my mum, she did drive to come and pick me up, but she had created that anxiety, that separation anxiety, and she'd actively encouraged me to go, knowing that I remember her saying to me in the car on the way back, oh, I knew you wouldn't be able to, you would just hate it, but you insisted that you wanted to go. Why put a child in that position, that situation? And it felt really reminiscent to me watching my husband say, he's not going because it's not right for him. We can encourage him to go, and he would take the encouragement because he wouldn't want to disappoint everybody, but it's not right for him. And his mum just being so disappointed and upset, but also like, yeah, no, you've got to do what's right for the child. That's all that matters ever. And it was really heartwarming to see, but also quite difficult to navigate as someone who never had that experience and who felt so anxious about setting the boundary. My tummy was in bits going, oh God, I'm going to have to say he can't come. And knowing that I was going to step forward for my child in the way that people hadn't for me, but also feeling really anxious about upsetting someone that I also care about. I just want to jump back a minute as well to what I said earlier about that feeling of almost resentment. And I don't know if resentment's even the right word, but when you think, well, if this was my parent, it would be so much more dramatic. And I think part of that leads into that sad feeling when you can set boundaries and it is safe to set boundaries. Almost that, well, why can't it be with my parent? And you know, as I said before, on a logical level, you know why the reaction is different, why you can be so much calmer when someone who you're in a healthy relationship with oversteps a boundary. But there is that feeling of, but I've grown up with that not being healthy. So I don't understand why you're not as riled. And it's unfair. It's just unfair. Unfair is probably the word for it, because it is unfair that it would be a different scenario if it was your parent overstepping the boundary. It is unfair, but it's not his parents, her parents, your friends, whoever's fault. It's your parents' fault, but in lieu of being able to do anything about it, there is this great feeling of frustration and unfairness that if the roles were reversed, you would be kicking off about what my mum's done. I would be kicking off about what my mum's done or my dad's done or whatever that might be. But when something similar touches that nerve and we have a much calmer, much more muted reaction and we can set the boundary in a healthy way, there's that feeling of, well, hang on a minute. And it's such a difficult thing to explain, and I'm hoping that people listening to it are hearing what I'm saying and thinking, yeah, no, I get you, because that's my lived experience too. It is a resentment in a way that other people can be healthy and your parent can't. It's a feeling of, that's just so unjust, that's just so unfair. And not in a spoiled child stamp your foot way of, that's unfair, but in a, actually that's really unfair and that's the card that I was dealt. And it's not okay that my family member couldn't come through for me. And it's not okay that I had to set the hardest of boundaries sometimes, like in my case, having to set the boundary of no contact. In fact, that's another great example of where I've tried to set boundaries and my mum's reaction has been wild. My boundary to my mum when we ended up being no contact, and I know I've said this before on other episodes, my boundary to my mum was that I didn't want her to come to our house for dinner anymore. That I wanted her to do what we had always agreed when we bought the house that we lived in and built her an annex, was that if things were not right, she would move out. We would make sure that she was set up in a totally separate home and we'd all have our own spaces if she'd sold the house to complete strangers. And me saying, we need more space, we need to not have you as involved in our lives because it's destroying our relationship, was enough to make her go down the route of, I'm going to end up pushing you into no contact. I'm going to go down the route of solicitors and demand thousands and thousands of pounds more, tens of thousands of pounds more, so you can pay me out for the trouble that you've caused me. I'm going to demand that I get to stay on your property and see you and see your children every day, even though I don't want a relationship with you anymore because you're evil. That was the reaction. That's the kind of reaction that I would get when I tried to set a boundary. And it feels really unfair that that's not the reaction that other people get, because it is unfair. And you can dwell on that and you can feel maudling about that, or you can grieve it and you can acknowledge it and accept that those were the cards that were dealt. It is unfair and nothing that you do is going to change it. But that doesn't mean that when you see your partner having a healthy relationship, when you feel that conflicting emotion, when you can set a healthy boundary, it doesn't feel that there's anything wrong with you or that you are spoiled or ungrateful in those scenarios, just that it's hitting a really deep wound because of the unfairness of how you were raised. I've also had clients who have been through the process of setting that ultimate boundary and who have determined that they're going to cut contact because that's what's right for their family, and then noticed a lot of similar traits in in-laws or in sister-in-laws, brother-in-laws, whatever that might be, and have been really frustrated when their partner is not willing to step forward and set the same boundaries, when their partner is not willing to step forward and say, hang on a minute, that's not okay, but was quite happy for them to do it for the better of the family and encouraged them to set their boundaries, stood behind them whilst they set their boundaries, but continues to allow toxic behaviour to go on over here in their family unit, or rather extended family unit. And I think that's an extremely difficult thing to navigate, because when you feel like you have set such firm boundaries and you have held such firm boundaries and you have stepped forward, you're done with the toxicity, you're protecting your peace, and then you notice that actually your peace is being attacked from a different angle by different people, and hang on a minute, that person that's meant to be supportive of you in the way that they were supportive of you when you were perhaps cutting contact or setting really hard boundaries with family members who were behaving toxically, they're not going to do it now that they're the ones in the hot seat. Are you kidding me? Are you absolutely shitting me? Because that's just going to brush up against everything. Not only are you going to have the feelings of, hang on a minute, when this was my parents, and that resentment and that feeling of unfairness, you're also going to feel to some degree betrayed and let down, because here's this person who was quite happy for you to go through this process and now isn't willing to go through the process, isn't willing to do what's needed in order to protect your little family. And that's really difficult to watch. You can't force someone to have a set of boundaries, and you can't force someone to behave a certain way towards their family. And if you're listening to this and it's your partner who has toxic family members and you're really struggling with them not setting boundaries, I would put it to you that you have to protect your peace and you have to protect your children. And if they're not willing to be in that with you, to whatever means, that is their choice. We can't control what people do. We can't say to somebody, look, you need to tell your parents that we'll never see them again because of this behaviour. What you can do is say, I will not be going to their house again. I will not be coming round, and my children will not be because of the way they speak to them. But if you want to have that relationship, that's fine. But in my experience, the issues that cause are huge, and it's, again, really unfair and really difficult. And it goes back to respecting each other's autonomy, respecting that your partner might have to deal with this in their way, but that you can set your boundaries whilst you need to do that. And if they are unwilling to do that, again, you have the only responsibility that you have is to protecting your peace and to protecting your children. And if they're not willing to protect themselves as adults, that is not something that you can change. But you do have to ask yourself, at what point does this become unlivable? And I think that's such a difficult thing. My relationship with my mum absolutely decimated my marriage. It had a huge impact. And my partner's reaction to that was not to say, hey, this is destroying our relationship. This is causing problems for me. But was to really let me down and was to treat me really badly as well. And that's not me saying, oh, woe is me, because he was suffering as well. But his reaction to that was not to support, but was to harm. And it would have been much healthier if he'd have just said, hey, look, I can't stay like this. And I would have known that this was having such a big impact on us, to the point where it was driving him to destroy our marriage. Unfortunately, through a lot of work, we've managed to get back to a place where we are in a healthier place. But I know now that I would never want to get to that point again, where we were so at loggerheads, we were so unhappy. His behaviour was absolutely unacceptable towards me, rather than just communicating openly and effectively. And this is the problem that we face when we see these wider ripples of these relationships and the toxic family dynamics and how they invade so much of your relationship. And I think as much as we are in partnerships, we have to decide as individuals what protects our peace and what we can and cannot live with. And sometimes that means stepping away from the toxicity. And if our partner can't do that with us, then that might mean stepping away from them. And that's really difficult to do when you love someone and you can see that they're in a toxic situation and you wish that they could set those boundaries, they could step away from these things, they could pull themselves out of this toxic cycle. But if they can't do it, you can't make them. And you can't be the one to constantly set the boundary, because at the end of the day, that just breeds resentment. Now, you can sit down and have a conversation and say, I can't stay in this relationship because your parents behave this way and you're not setting the boundaries that are needed. I can't do this, I can't do that because of what's happening here. And it's about open, honest communication, giving someone the choices and the opportunity to change their behaviour and set their boundaries and protect their family unit. And that's what's so difficult and such a big learning curve. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, guys. I hope that did resonate with you, whichever part of it did. I have a fabulous guest on next week's podcast episode, which I'm super excited about. Do remember that if you ever want to share your story, whether it's anonymously or whether you are wanting to come on and chat as a professional, I love to have people on here sharing their lived experiences. I think it is one of the most powerful parts of this podcast, is sharing those lived experiences so people can realise they are not on their own. This is not something that is as shrouded in shame and as taboo as it was maybe 10 years ago. We're going to change that narrative and bring it out into the light. And you're not alone. And that's the one takeaway I'd like you to have from this podcast. I will speak to you again soon, guys. Bye.